over the last couple of weeks, we've looked rather quickly at how the people of Israel came to be living in the land of Egypt. How God had used Joseph through difficult circumstances to be in Egypt at a time of great famine, and how Joseph invited eventually his family to come and live there, and they settled there in the land. Well, this morning's passage is about roughly 320 years later. Now, many of us will know the story that I've just read to us from Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2. Moses, the baby who's hidden in a basket in the bulrushes on the River Nile, and how he's found by Pharaoh's daughter who plucks him out and eventually adopts him as her own child. But what I'd like us to do this morning is to think about the realities of that story. Because it's often when we know these stories, we to think of them in a very sort of children's picture book sort of way. And we don't really get into what's actually being said. Some of the horrors and what it must have been like for people involved. And that's what I'd like us to focus on this morning. Just those things of the realities that really stand out from this story. And the first one is this. I'd like us to notice that wrong fears lead to wrong actions. What do I mean by that? Well, 320 years earlier, the people of Egypt had welcomed the people of Israel to live in the land. But that was 320 years ago, and there wasn't so many of them. And the people of Israel had grown in number. And what we get also growing is a wrong fear. The fear that actually these people are now outgrowing us in number. And Pharaoh plants the argument, well, if these people grow stronger, and if a war comes, and if these people then turn against us, we'll be in trouble. Now think about that. At the time he's saying it, there is no war. There is no suggestion that the people of Israel are going to turn against them. But there is a wrong fear that these people could create a problem. And what does the wrong fear do? Wrong fear leads to wrong actions. And what is the outcome? What is the suggestion Pharaoh comes up with? Well, basically, it's genocide. Let's get rid of those people. And we read these stories in the Bible and we think, oh, it couldn't be. It's too extreme. Nobody would do that. And we don't take it as a real story. But we know as recently as well, my father's generation, people were transported from all parts of Europe into death camps and put into gas chambers. These things can happen. And we look at that point of history and we think, but after what we've seen that, it could never happen again. Surely nobody would repeat that. And then we've got to think about Cambodia in the 1970s, or Rwanda in 1994, or Kosovo in 1999. And we think, well, but it couldn't happen today. What about the Rohingya people in Myanmar at the moment? One of the most horrifying traits of human nature is unfounded fear that seems to cause people to think, well, we better hit them first just in case they ever hit us. And, well, wrong fear leads to wrong actions. But the second thing I'd like us to spot from this reading is that right fear leads to right actions. Contrast what we've just been talking about with the response of the midwives. You know, at that time, quite clearly from the sort of things he was suggesting, Pharaoh was not the sort of person to be messed with. And Pharaoh had given a very clear instruction to the midwives: when you go to the people of Israel to deliver a child, if it's a boy, you're to kill it. But actually, the midwives have been taught differently. They've been brought up differently. They feared God. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 10 says this: "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." The Hebrew midwives have been brought up to know that, to live that out. And because of that, they made right choices. And they were willing to make the right choice irrespective of the cost. They knew what was right. They were determined to do it. You don't mess with people like Pharaoh. We don't have to look far back in the news to think just how dangerous, extremely vicious leaders can be. You don't mess with Pharaoh. But no, they knew what was right, and despite what could have been the personal cost, they were determined to do what was right. And what I really like about this story, and what we see very clearly, is God honoured their actions. God honoured that they're doing it. And actually he honoured it in a number of ways. He honoured it in terms of the outcome for the people of Israel. Actually, their action was God's first victory over Pharaoh. Think about it. We all know how the story progresses. Moses, who grew up, who went back to Egypt, who said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," who pronounced plagues, and plagues came. God had great victories in the future over Pharaoh, but this was the first one. And it says in verse 20 and 21, "So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful." And then it goes on. He also blesses the midwives for their obedience. 21, "And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own." Now, this morning, when evil seems to dominate, it's always worth remembering that individual actions can make a real difference. The actions of an individual make a real difference. I always remember, because the thought really stood out to me when some years ago I heard the argument about the awful atrocities that happened in Europe in the 1940s, where people were transported to death camps and put into gas chambers. And the discussion was, how culpable was every individual that was around at the time? And the argument I always remember was, what about the signalman who sat in the signal box at the side of the railway line, and all he did was pull a lever when the train came along, so that the train, instead of going off on that route, it was sent off on the route that led to the concentration camp. All he did was pull a lever. How culpable is the individual? Just think, what would have been the difference if everybody had pulled a lever and said, "No, I know what's right. I am not pulling that lever." Trains would have never got to the destination. Multiply that out to all the individual actions. Actually, the choices individuals make, even in extreme times, can make all the difference. For us to make a real difference, it takes two things. It takes a knowledge of what is right and wrong. It takes that knowledge of God that we need to have, that we see things differently, that when the whole world is going one way, we actually say, actually, no, That is not right. And actually, that is much harder than we imagine. Because we live in a world where all our thinking is bombarded by things that influence us massively. Television news reports, newspapers, all this is how everybody is thinking. Actually, to think differently, we really need to work on having a knowledge of God, on seeking him, on making sure we're fed with a different understanding. And the second thing then it takes is having the courage to say, no matter what effect it might have on me, I'm going to say no. It takes the courage to do what is right. And actually in this story, even with that, we've had wrong fear, we've had right fear. The final thing I'd like us to concentrate on is probably the worst fear. Because what we see in this passage is also what many of us would imagine must be the worst fear. There's a young couple at that time who've married and they've had a son. And the instruction there is that all sons are to be thrown into the river. So what do? They hide the child for 3 months. And then, well, they know they can't keep the child hidden any longer. The child is going to be discovered and the child has no future. So the child has no future with them. So, of course, what the mother does is she makes a basket and she waterproofs it and they place it in the Nile themselves. In a way, what they're doing, it's almost like putting their child up for adoption. We can no longer provide for that child. We cannot look after it ourselves. We're going to have to give it away. We have no choice. And it's awful to think that that is the choice facing some parents in the world today. They know that they have a child. They care for their child. They love their child. They do what they can. But they are simply not in a position to look after that child. Moses' parents had no other choice. And what we see in this passage and those most awful of circumstances is that they do what they can do and they trust God for what they can't do. And looking back on that incident, Hebrews 11 in the New Testament, a great passage on faith, says about that time in Hebrews 11:23, it was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's commands. Basically what they did is they did what they could and they trusted God for what they cannot do. And when they do that, what we see very clearly in this passage, when we look at it carefully, is that actually in every human being there is something about the image of God. Because human beings were created in the image of God. Now, all right, in the fall that was lost. And an evil came in and people changed. But there's still in every individual something of the image of God. And where we see that is in Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter was not brought up with any knowledge of God. Pharaoh's daughter was not brought up to know what was right and wrong. Pharaoh's daughter was brought up in Pharaoh's palace, the palace of a dictator. Think of how she would have been taught to think about people. Think about how she would have been brought up. We are superior, they are lesser. We deserve looking after, they do not. That would have been her background. And yet, when she opened the basket and she saw a baby, she had compassion on the baby. She sent somebody and said, I'll pay for this child to be looked after. In every individual, there is something about the image of God still there. And it's something we should never forget. And what we also see is actually what those of us who were here last week saw when we looked at the life of Joseph. For those who weren't here, we looked at Joseph and how he was sold as a slave by his brothers into Egypt. And he had awful experiences. And actually, God wouldn't have wanted him to go through those experiences, but their brothers' actions put him there. And what we saw that actually God acts from the most difficult of situations. In the most difficult of situations, God still acts. We made the point last week that, when we asked the question, why did God let this happen in the first place? It's because God's not starting from a blank canvas. Things are bad, but God always steps in and makes what is bad better. And we see that very clearly in Pharaoh's daughter. She took the child home as her own child eventually. And that meant that Moses was brought up in Pharaoh's palace. Now, for the things that God used Moses for later on in the story, when he goes back to Egypt and he goes to Pharaoh and says, you let the people of Israel go or else, a knowledge of the workings of Pharaoh's palace would have been essential. When we look at this passage as a real story involving real people, yet it is a difficult passage. And hopefully the situations we face in life will never be anything like as extreme. But when we do face difficulties, when the world simply is evil and we face hardships, how do we handle it? As Christian believers, what we're called to do is avoid the narrative that gives rise to wrong fear, because wrong fear leads to wrong actions. Seek God and commit ourselves as we seek him to doing what is right, no matter what the cost to ourselves, and then to trust him with the things that we ourselves cannot do. And at least in that way, we will always avoid being complicit in evil.